Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's GitHub Copilot mini event. I'm super excited to have y'all here. I hope you're having a good time at All In so far. So before we get started with the contents of this mini event, I want to kind of emphasize that you should make sure you register your attendance at the link I sent in the chat. This will help you monitor your progress throughout the course of the event. And you can also add in calendar invites if you look at the schedule. Before we dive into more content about GitHub Copilot, the AI programming assistant, my name is Gabriella. I'm a coach here at Major League Hacking. I use she, her pronouns, and a fun fact about me is that the Department of State misspelled my last name on my first passport, so I had to send it back, get that taken care of before I could actually board a plane with that passport, but we're all good now. So now kind of diving back into GitHub Copilot, our AI programming assistant. You might be wondering what GitHub Copilot is, why you would use it. We'll be covering all of this throughout the course of this mini event. And we'll be getting you set up with GitHub Copilot. We'll be getting you access, and I'll walk you through how to use it using the Visual Studio Code IDE and the GitHub Copilot extension you can use in Visual Studio Code. And after we get everything configured, I explain to you what GitHub Copilot is, and we get everything kind of squared away in your IDE. We'll be walking through an interactive tutorial using a sample Flask app and the GitHub Copilot extension to kind of walk through, debug that, and create some code with the Copilot extension. All right. So if you haven't heard of GitHub Copilot before, GitHub Copilot is an AI pair programmer. I also like to refer to GitHub Copilot as my programming assistant. GitHub Copilot can help you write, debug, and understand different pieces of code. I think it's very useful. It's made my life a lot easier when I'm going through tutorials or I'm looking at existing code bases. I love that it can explain things to me, like when I'm unsure and I'm just kind of diving into a new coding project. And this is kind of how GitHub Copilot will show up in your IDE is these different pop-ups. So you can see one that says create a new button component. And after you prompt GitHub Copilot with that command or that prompt, it'll start generating some sample code for that particular component. And as you can see, the next one says fix, my var is undefined. So this is a command, the fix command. If you give it some more information on the bug you're having, it can provide some additional context and potentially even find you a solution. I think this is a lot easier than kind of going back and forth between an IDE and your typical GPT because you're not going back and forth between two different browsers. And it's in line with your code, so it has all the context it needs when it's providing solutions or potential more information on your code. And as you can see here, the last command we have is the explain command. This is a very useful command for when you're getting acquainted with a new code base or you don't understand something because you maybe weren't the one who coded it. Maybe it was a part of a group project. You don't quite understand your teammates' logic for a particular code block and they didn't really document it. This is a great way to understand kind of what's going on there. All right. So you might be wondering, okay, GitHub Copilot sounds kind of cool, but why would you use it? Why use this as opposed to a traditional GPT? I think that it's really cool because it's in line in your IDE. It's very helpful when you're coding. And also when GitHub asked developers how they felt when they were using GitHub Copilot, developers felt they were 55% faster at coding. And also I want to kind of emphasize the satisfaction and well-being statistics. It looks like over half of developers felt less frustrated when coding and more fulfilled when working on their code bases when using GitHub Copilot. And I can definitely see why, because it makes your life a lot easier and easier to understand very complex topics when you're coding. So now that we've provided a little bit of a background on GitHub Copilot, why would you use it, and kind of a like background of this GPT-4 kind of like coding assistant. I'm going to help you all get set up with GitHub Copilot so we can dive into a tutorial. In the meantime, if you have any questions about GitHub Copilot or this project throughout the entire walkthrough, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll answer them as I go along with this tutorial. So GitHub Copilot is different essentially because it lives where you write code. This is kind of a comic strip joke about what kind of IDE or code editors real programmers use. Everyone has their opinions. You don't need to hash out the debate in the chat because we'll be using VS Code for this particular tutorial, but you can integrate GitHub Copilot wherever you write code. Here are a few examples of different places where you can integrate GitHub Copilot. So VS Code, Visual Studio, Vim, NeoVim, and all the JetBrains IDEs, something like PyCharm or IntelliJ come to mind. And you can also use GitHub Copilot in your command line through the GitHub like command line interface, which I think is a really helpful tool. So to get started, I'm going to need everyone to install Visual Studio Code if you don't already have it. You can install it by heading to code.visualstudio.com. We will be using Visual Studio Code for a few reasons today. First is that it has IntelliSense, which essentially means that the IDE has smart completions for your code, which can be helpful when you're trying to code up a project that has a lot of similar verbiage. This can be helpful, as well as the built-in Git and all of the extensions that VS Code has. So if you don't already have VS Code installed, take this time to install it now at the URL on screen. I'll give you all a few minutes to go through that. All right, if you were able to install VS Code or you already have it installed locally, if you can send like a check mark or an emoji in the chat, kind of giving me a heads up that y'all are ready to move on to the Copilot installation. I also want to emphasize that if you don't already have the GitHub Student Developer Pack, it will take a little while to get access to GitHub Copilot if you aren't going to go for the free trial. If you are not a student, you can access GitHub Copilot through their free trial. But if you are a student, you get free access through the GitHub Student Developer Pack, which I will show you a link to in just a few. Awesome. It looks like we have some people who have completed the VS Code installation, or maybe already had it installed on their computer. So the next thing I'm going to do is walk you through installing GitHub Copilot locally in your VS Code. So what you're going to do is you're going to hit Shift P or Command P, depending on which type of computer you use. If you're using a Mac, it'll be Command, I guess, no, not Shift P. It'll be Control Shift P or Command Shift P, depending on if you're running on PC or Mac. And after you hit this, you should get the search bar up at the top. There's a screenshot on the slide that has kind of a search bar. And in the search bar, you're going to type install extension. And then you're going to click on the install extension that pops up. All right, so once we have hit install extension, you should get a pop-up like this. It will show you some popular extensions that are available in VS Code. I recommend looking through all the extensions that you can install in VS Code. I feel like it's a great way to kind of improve your development experience. But today we're only going to be focusing on GitHub Copilot. So you're going to type in the search bar on the left here, GitHub Copilot. And once you type in that, you should be getting a screen that looks like this. When you type in GitHub Copilot, there are a lot of different results, a lot of themes, a lot of kind of like supercharged Copilots. You don't need to install those right now. Just install the GitHub Copilot that looks like this and has the verified check mark from GitHub, and you'll hit install to install this extension into your VS Code. All right. I'll give y'all a few minutes to walk through the GitHub Copilot extension. If there are any questions or having any issues about this, then feel free to send those questions or the bugs you're running into in the chat. Looks like someone else or someone in the chat is already set up with GitHub Copilot using the developer pack. Love to hear that. One of the best aspects I think of the developer pack is access to GitHub Copilot. Normally it costs like $10 a month or something. That as a student, you're able to use it for free through the developer pack. And I'd be very, I guess, sad to lose access to Copilot after I eventually graduate. All right. So if you were able to install the Copilot extension, you should be relatively good to go. I do want to emphasize, though, if you have not already installed Git on your computer, you will need to do that in order to log into GitHub and have access to Copilot. And you can do so by clicking on the version control icon, which is the third icon from the top on the left-hand side. Awesome. So now that we've installed Copilot, we're going to walk through activating Copilot. So like I said earlier, Copilot is like it costs money if you're not a student, but luckily for y'all, if you're a student, you're able to get it for free through the GitHub Student Developer Pack. And you can access the Student Developer Pack if you don't have it already at this URL. I'm going to send it in the chat as well. But this will redirect you to the Student Developer Pack. And I will also send a link to a free trial of GitHub Copilot in the chat if you're not a student and would like to access Copilot for a little while. All right, and then here is the link for the free trial of Copilot if you are not a student. If you go through the process of verifying your status as a student on here, it will take a little while to verify. Likely it won't verify before the end of this mini event, but it should be kind of confirmed by the end of this weekend, and hopefully you'll be able to use it in your hack throughout this weekend. What you'll need to do is kind of add your university as well as your .edu email, and then to verify your status as a student, you either upload an image of your student ID if your student ID has a date or semester on it, and if your student ID doesn't have a date on it, don't fear, mine doesn't either. You can always upload a screenshot of your semester schedule, a tuition bill, or even a transcript, as long as it has that university name, the university letterhead, the date, like the actual date or a semester, as well as your name. You can utilize that to verify your status as a student. How are y'all doing with verifying your status as a student on the Student Developer Pack? Do y'all already have the Student Developer Pack? Are you able to go through the verification process? How's that going for y'all? It looks like Sam already has a developer pack. Love to hear it. So the activation process for Copilot will be very easy if you already have the Student Developer Pack. Someone says, it took me 2 applications in 1 week to do it because I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm assuming maybe because you cropped something out. I don't know. But sometimes it does take a little while to get your developer pack approved. We do have this link that is expedited for MLH attendees, but it's still not instant. Okay. Chess said it was an insufficient screenshot. That sometimes happens. So make sure that you get all the information in your screenshot and are fully reading what they're looking for in that description when you're getting in the student developer pack. All right. It looks like a good amount of y'all have the GitHub student developer pack. So that we've kind of taken care of that, I'm going to walk you through actually using GitHub Copilot and how you can use it to supercharge your hacks. So let's go. So in order to use GitHub Copilot, you'll need to actually have some sort of code file or project opening up in VS Code, and you'll do this by hitting open a new window, and then you're going to select the clone git repo button. You can see underneath the start menu, it's the third from the top. It says open git repository, and it has this version control icon next to it. And then what you're going to want to do is clone mlh/copilot starter. And this is a simple Flask app that we'll be walking through together to show you how you can use GitHub Copilot. But if you don't have access to Copilot or you don't have Git installed yet, don't worry. I'll be showing you my screen in just a little bit and walking through the entire process. And if you did just install VS Code, you might also need to install Git, which you can do on the third from the top icon on the left-hand side and log into your GitHub account. All right. So after you've done that and you've cloned the repository, you should be seeing something like this. This is app.py. This is the main bulk of the file we're working in. And this is what I'm going to switch over to my code space with like this code. Code space is with GitHub, and you're able to open up different code files in the browser that you have saved to GitHub, and you're able to use GitHub Copilot in the browser, which I think is really helpful, especially when streaming, because it's a lot easier to share my screen in the browser that way. So give me 1 second to switch over my screen, and then we can get started actually using GitHub Copilot. All right. So as you can see here, I did not switch my screens. Okay, code space has stopped. I'm gonna have to restart it. But essentially, this is going to be the same thing that y'all should be seeing on the desktop. And you're more than welcome to use GitHub code spaces as well. I believe it's a pro feature, but if you have the developer pack, you have pro GitHub. For the person who said my screen is too small, are you able to see the overall black code space screen now? Would you still like me to increase the size? I will slightly. All right, I think that's a little bit better. Now I'm going to dive into GitHub Copilot and all the functionality for this particular application. So here we have the simple browser. It looks like our app is already broken, which is okay because we'll be using Copilot and a few questioning skills to get our Flask app working. But if you click here we have our app.py file. This is where the bulk of our application lives. Flask apps will sometimes have other files and templates and things like that. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we'll just have the one simple app.py file. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of see like what's going on because this is a new code file. I didn't write this. This was from the MLH Copilot starter. I want to hit Control or Command I, and it looks like I did not install the extension on code spaces. Code spaces on occasion will you'll have to like reinstall things if your account isn't fully synced. So I'm going to hit install here on Copilot, and it's installing Copilot into this code space. And then I'm going to hit Command I once more, and here we see Copilot is popping up in my browser. And I'm going to ask it to explain this code because I just got here. I'm not quite sure what's going on in the code file, and I think that Copilot could explain what's going on, maybe help me better dive into development with this Flask app. As you can see, when it's explaining something, it will oftentimes have kind of like a side chat pop up on like to the left. And this is very useful because it has a lot of text. Sometimes it has reference code and you're able to read through it a little bit more like documentation. But when it's suggesting code, it'll have that pop-up icon directly in the IDE. All right, so it gave me a lot of information. And as we can see here, it's using the app.py file as our reference, and it's telling me a lot of things. This Python script is a simple web application built using the Flask framework. Flask is a micro web framework written in Python. It doesn't require particular tools or libraries, making it light and easy for creating web applications. Okay, I think that's a good explanation of Flask. I've used Flask before, so I know what Flask is, but I think that's helpful if you're new to a framework or a language to have a little bit of a background on it before you dive into coding. It then tells me that the script starts by importing the Flask module on line 1. So that's what we see right here, that Flask is being imported. The Flask module contains the functionality needed to create a web application. Okay, that's helpful. This is what we'll need to actually make our web app. On line 2, the time module is imported. This module provides various time-related functions. In this particular case, it's used to get the current time in seconds since the epoch, the point where time starts, which is the 1st of January in 1970 for Unix systems. So that's the time we'll be finding, the time that has passed since January 1st, 1970. It then goes on to tell me that on line 4, an instance of the Flask class is created and assigned to the variable app. It tells me the name argument is a special variable in Python, which gets a value as the name of a module of which it's used. Flask uses the location of the module passed here as a starting point when it needs to load associated resources such as template files. All right, so this is actually creating an instance of the Flask class, and it's assigning it to the app, so we're able to actually run our Flask application. All right. Okay, I'm glad my screen is okay. Looks like there's a few questions and comments about that. If that changes at any point, leave a comment in the chat, and I can work to fix that. So then it goes on to tell me that the function seconds since epoch, this function right here, uses the time function to get the current time in seconds since the epoch, and then converts it to an integer using the int function. So right here, it's assigning the time since the epoch in seconds to the epoch variable. And then later, my bad, I should have turned on Do Not Disturb. I'm getting a FaceTime call. Apologies for that. Okay, and then where was I? It converts the integer using the int function. So it's returning the time in seconds since the epoch, but it's converting it to an integer, likely so it's easier for the application to kind of like read this out and for us to see it. GitHub Copilot then goes on to explain that the app route decorator on line 10 right here is telling Flask what URL should trigger the function that follows it. So in this particular case, the main route, which is what you see when you go to index.html or the main web page on any web application, what's going to happen is what's happening in the function right here. So the main web page, we're calling our seconds function, which will be returning the integer of the seconds since the epoch. All right, so I think this was a pretty good explanation. I now know pretty well what's going on in this application. And I also know a good amount more about Flask than I did otherwise. I'm going to split the screen so that I have the simple browser on one side, which is essentially just what the Flask app is doing, and then I have my code on the right side, so we're able to see them simultaneously. And it looks like right here, we have a type error. Type error, the view function did not return a valid response. The return type must be a string, dict, list, tuple with headers or status, response instance, or WSGI callable, but it was an integer. So it looks like us converting this to an integer was not actually a good idea because it's giving us this type error. So I think that like we could fix it by returning a string rather than an integer. But let's see what GitHub Copilot comes up with and if it's that. So I'm going to say fix and see if it realizes the error if I just highlight this one line. And it's saying to fix the code, I would add the missing import statement for the time module inside the selected code block. So it's not properly solving our issue because it hasn't been given enough context. It doesn't have this type error. It's thinking that we just haven't imported time, but we already have. So what I'm going to say is type error, I can spell, type error, return can't be an int. And then let's see what it says. To fix the type error where the return value cannot be an int, I would modify the second since epoch function to return a string. All right. And as we can see here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see it. The recommended code is to replace the return int epoch statement with returning the int epoch converted to a string. I think this is a pretty acceptable solution. So I'm going to hit accept. And then as you can see, it already changed that code in line. It's not going to automatically show up on our browser. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill the Flask app that's running, and then I'm going to run it again by saying Flask run. And it should be running again in the simple browser. And as you can see here, our second since epoch is now working, which is awesome. Okay, so now we have the second since epoch. That's functioning pretty well. The next thing I want to do is kind of just expand our application a bit. It's a pretty simple application, and I think we can really expand it to be a much more high-powered and more multifunctional project. And I think the first thing we can do is ask it to create like a new route or just like a new function so we can have more information in this particular application. So what I'm going to ask it to do is I'm going to ask it, I clicked command slash, so create a function that returns the hours since epoch. This is creating 2 blocks of code right here. So here we see the initial function I asked for. It's saying hours since epoch. It's finding the epoch and it's returning the string. It's returning the hour since epoch as a string so we don't get any more of those type errors. And in here, like the bulk of this, we're seeing the epoch, which is the seconds since the epoch, and it's getting divided by 3,600, which is good because there are 3,600 seconds in an hour. So I think this function looks pretty good. We might be able to save some space if we just pulled in or called the second since epoch function, be reusing a function rather than recalling the epoch. But I think it uses the same amount of code lines, so I don't really think we necessarily need to do that right now. I think this is good enough. And then we can also see here, it's creating a second app route, and it's going to be at /hours. So when we go to our route, if you're doing this locally, you would be doing this at the localhost 127. You'd pull this up and do /hours, and then you'd get whatever is being returned by this function, which at the hours route, we're seeing it's returning this particular variable that's being called within the hour since epoch function. So we would see the hour since epoch at the hours route. So I'm going to hit accept. I think this is coming along pretty well. It's not going to automatically update, I don't think. I'm going to go to my preview and I'm going to type in hours and see if it shows us anything. It says that URL is not found, which means that our Flask app is not auto updating, which means I need to kill the application and I'm going to rerun the Flask app by saying Flask run. As we can see here, it's running again. We're seeing the second since the epoch at the main page, but I don't want the second since the epoch. I want the hours. So I'm going to go to the hours route. And as you can see here, we have the hours since the epoch. It's a much smaller number than the seconds since the epoch. All right, so now we have a pretty fleshed out app. We have the hours since the epoch, as well as this seconds since the epoch. Well, there's one other, I guess, unit of time I think we're missing, and that is the minutes since the epoch. So I'm going to ask it to do something similar, but with the minutes. I'm going to say, can you do the same thing, but for minutes? And you see here, it's thinking, and it generated some more code pretty quickly. It created an almost identical function for the minutes since the epoch, but this time it's dividing epoch by 60 because there's only 60 seconds in each minute. And then it's going to return the minutes since the epoch being called by the function at this minutes root. So I think it looks all good to me. I'm going to hit accept. And as you can see, we have all of our functions, the root at the default root, which is just slash. This will be showing us seconds. And then at minutes, we'll see the minutes since epoch. And then at hours, we'll see the hours since epoch. So I'll try it one more time and see if for some reason it's auto-updating in our browser. I'm going to type in minutes. And again, it's not found. So we're going to kill this Flask application. And I'm going to type Flask run. It's updating. It's thinking. It's back to the default seconds page. I'm going to go to hours again. Double check on that. Looks like that's still running pretty well. Now I'm going to go to minutes. And here we have the minutes. It's a bigger number than hours because, of course, there are less seconds in a minute than there are in an hour. All right. So I think there's maybe 2 more different functions we could integrate. But first, I'm going to show you some cool tools you can use in the GitHub Copilot extension that are really helpful. So in addition to the explain function, as well as the fix function and the generating function that y'all saw, the fix function fixed our first error, and then we use the generate function to expand the functionality of our application. You can also use a few different other commands in GitHub Copilot. So I'm going to say GitHub doc, and what this does is essentially document your code for you. If you don't like documenting code, I think this is a great way to kind of cut down on the time you need to spend doing that, and also have your coworkers or your classmates really appreciate your code because you'll have very thorough documentation. I do want to emphasize that you do want to read through this and make sure it's accurately kind of portraying what you're doing in these code, and like in these code snippets, so you don't have inaccurate documentation. But it seems like this documentation seems to be pretty accurate. Returns the number of seconds since the Unix epoch, returns the number of seconds since the Unix epoch with the string. And this one says the same thing, but for minutes, it shows that our returns. This one shows the number of hours since the epoch. And this is telling us this is a Flask route that returns the seconds since the epoch, as well as the returns. This is showing us the same thing, but for minutes and for hours. I don't necessarily think I need all this documentation for this particular app. So I'm not going to hit accept because I don't want all this additional documentation. But for more complex applications, I think this is a great feature to kind of help you get started on the documentation process and really make your apps very readable and helpful for all the people you're pair programming with, or maybe who are on your team and don't have the time to walk through directly with you because you have time conflicts or something. Another awesome feature in GitHub Copilot is the test feature. If I can, yeah, here we go. So this will create unit tests for your code, which I think is an excellent feature. So it will create a whole new file. As you can see here, it's in the test app py file, and it's creating a bunch of unit tests for the setup as well as our different functions. So in this case, it's going to be seconds, minutes, and hours. It's not a very complex unit test because there's only one right answer because it's a kind of a set in stone date of January 1st, 1970 for the epoch on Unix. But if you have more complex applications, I think having GitHub Copilot help you with your unit test is a great application of this, and will really help you supercharge and make sure that those hacks or those projects are running as efficiently as possible, and you won't need to spend nearly as much time kind of ensuring that. So I'm going to save this just for the sake of having it, and we can maybe run this in a second. But the first thing I want to do before I kind of go through the unit testing py file is add in a few more measurements of time just because we have the time for it. I'm going to say do the same thing, but for days, months, and years. So this is giving us more of a larger like overall time view of the amount of time that's passed since the epoch. This one's going to think for a while. It's creating a lot of different functions. So here we see the days since epoch, because there are 24 hours in a day and 3,600 seconds in an hour. I believe that's right. Can do the math very quickly. Let's see, 86,400 divided by 24 is 3,600. So yes, that's accurate. And then for the months since the epoch, the number gets larger. I would assume it's just based on 30 days standard in a month, but I'm curious what it is based off of. So if we have 2,592,000, and then we're dividing that by the days, which is 86,500. I mistyped, so give me 1 second. All right, so it is basing that just off like a standard 30-day month. So that might give us a little bit like something that's like not too accurate with things like leap years where you have February that's a little bit longer, or months that have 31 days, but I think it's relatively accurate. And then for the year since the epoch, it's doing something similar. And here we see the routes where it's doing the same thing we had at all of those other routes at minutes and hours. So I'm going to hit accept. It's greatly expanded our application. And you know what that means? It's time for us to kill and rerun the Flask app. I do that by hitting Control C. And then I'm going to type in Flask run. As you can see here, it's reloading. We're back to seconds again. Let's go to years and see how many years since the epoch. It's been 54 years. Let's see how many months since the epoch. It's been 659 months since the epoch. And for days, it has been 19,791 days since the Unix epoch. I think this is a really cool application, and I feel like we've fleshed it out almost as much as possible for the measurement of time we have. The next thing I want to do is go through our unit tests and see how well those unit tests generated are doing. So I'm going to kill the Flask app, and I'm going to run, let's do Python test app.py. Okay, it ran 3 tests in less than a second, and it's telling us okay. So it looks like all of our tests are passing, which is pretty cool. Awesome. Do we have any questions about GitHub Copilot or anything I just ran y'all through? If you were able to follow along, you would have converted the MLH starter GitHub Copilot repository into a more fully fledged application. But if not, I hope you were able to at least gain some insight into the practical applications of GitHub Copilot and how it can really help you with your hacks and kind of supercharge your productivity through a short period like a hackathon. All right. If there aren't any questions, I'm going to move back to my slides and provide some additional resources for learning more about GitHub Copilot. But if you do have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat in the meantime. We'll have to go through all the screenshots because I walked you all through that in the browser. But next steps, after we've kind of walked through and shown y'all how GitHub Copilot works, hopefully we've gotten access to GitHub Copilot, are able to install the extension into VS Code. First thing I want to emphasize is that GitHub Copilot does make errors, just like me and you, but it doesn't have the same information as me and you. So GitHub Copilot is trained on OpenAI's GPT-4 model. So similarly to ChatGPT, sometimes it's going to write bad code or give you the wrong answers, and it won't always understand what you're wanting or what you're looking for. So keep that in mind when you're using GitHub Copilot as your assistant. And because it doesn't have the same information as you and I, because it only has code samples up to September 2021, we have access to code samples and updates to libraries, APIs, all the way up to modern day. We just have to spend a little bit more time looking for them as opposed to Copilot. And I really want to emphasize read, understand, and edit all the code that GitHub Copilot produces, really understand it, and ensure that you're using it truly as an AI assistant rather than doing all the heavy lifting in your coding projects. If you are a student and you're going to be utilizing it when you're working through homework, which could be helpful if you're trying to explain things, I'd heavily recommend do not select, like not selecting the check mark. It'll prompt you to provide suggestions from the web because that could very easily lead to code plagiarism, which is something you really want to avoid, especially if you're in university. And I do want to emphasize that you want to make sure that you understand everything that Copilot is doing and truly using it as an assistant to kind of supercharge and make your development process go faster rather than just using Copilot as the default coder. If you're interested in Copilot and you thought that the applications were interesting throughout this workshop, I heavily recommend using Copilot throughout the course this weekend. I think it's a great way to kind of like add an additional team member, if you say, who's very well versed on different coding concepts and is able to kind of make different functions and code things up very rapidly. And the best part of adding Copilot as a teammate is that Copilot won't even ask for prizes if you end up winning something at the hackathon. If you're interested in learning more about Copilot and how you can integrate it into your day-to-day development cycle, we have some additional resources for you. Their first hack pack is a link to different Copilot guides, and this is where you can go through the different functions of GitHub Copilot and all the different supported environments. Maybe you're not a VS Code enthusiast. Maybe you like to use a different IDE I talked about earlier. These guides will walk you through the process of that installation and the different functionalities in those IDEs, as well as the different functions in GitHub Copilot. I walked you through a decent amount throughout this mini event, but there are more, and GitHub Copilot is always creating more, so that will be the most up-to-date resource. And then the second link we have, the hack pack here, is Copilot examples. And this is how you can see a little bit more practically how GitHub Copilot can assist you while you're working and how you can integrate it into your day-to-day development cycle. And then lastly, we have a link for Copilot configurations. And this is how you can learn how to configure Copilot to your personal preferences and how you code. And I think this is really helpful because you're able to integrate it more fully in a genuine way to how you develop things. I'll leave those on screen so y'all can copy those down or use them throughout the weekend if you'd like. But if you have any questions about GitHub Copilot, please drop them in the chat. I'd be happy to answer them and help you with any questions or issues you might be having. All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to drop the link one more time in the chat for event registration. Be sure to register your attendance so we're getting all the information up to date for All In, and you're eligible to win any potential swag for the course this weekend. You're also able to add in calendar invites through the overall MLH events website. All right. Looks like there aren't any questions about GitHub Copilot. Feel free to drop any questions you have about it later in the Discord throughout the weekend. Myself or any of the other MLH coaches would be more than happy to help you out to use this tool throughout the weekend. But if not, happy hacking, and I hope you have a great rest of your weekend at All In.